plants, we cannot go forward into who we want to be until we clear up our relationship to these plants. And then finally, it's a political issue. In the same way that reproductive freedom is a political issue. I mean, ever since and before the signing of the Magna Carta, the main socio-political debate that has been waged in Western society is how free shall the individual be? And the thought has been pretty strongly planted that the individual should be as free as the individual can be without it dissolving the minimal social constraints to keep society together. And yet, as recently as 100 years ago, people were putting pants on piano legs because the Victorian mind felt that the unclad piano leg might lead young men to acts of self-abuse. Well, I'm sure it did. But a truly creative young man a truly creative young man will then evolve a fetish to the pants of piano legs so the party can go on. Women were given the vote in 1920. Slaves were freed in this country less than 130 years ago. One of the last places to free slaves, by the way. And that the United States was one of the last places to outlaw slavery. I mean, it had been anathema in Europe since 1820. Slavery is an interesting thing because the Romans had slavery on a massive scale, and Roman society ran on slavery. And then when the Roman Empire fell, slavery fell into disrepute. If you had a slave in the Middle Ages, you had one slave. And it meant that you were some heavy honcho. I mean, it was the equivalent of owning a Rembrandt. A slave was a luxury item beyond all imagining. And slaves played no role in society whatsoever in the medieval period. It was all serfs, landed serfs, who could not be bought and sold. Only as the land was bought and sold could they be, and they couldn't be moved off the land either. It had no relationship to slavery. Well, so then if slavery died at the close of the Roman Empire, how come the whole history of the Enlightenment is the history of getting entangled with slavery? Well, the answer is, strangely enough, a drug. The reason that slavery was brought back after being for 1,000 years in disgrace was for the production of sugar, for no other reason. Sugar at that time was produced under conditions of about 130 degrees of temperature, these boiling vats and crystallizing processes. No one would work sugar unless they were shackled and under the lash. And sugar is absolutely unnecessary. It's a complete luxury. Nobody needs sugar at all. In the year 1800, every ton of sugar entering England was being produced by slave labor. So here was the situation. It began with the Portuguese. They, even before the discovery of America, they had islands in the East Atlantic, the island of Madeira, and they had sugar holdings there, but they produced very minimal amounts of sugar. And then in a confrontation at sea, they captured a bunch of Arabs, pirates, basically, and they were about to have these guys walk the plank. And they said, listen, there are all these black people in the center of Africa who would make wonderful bonded labor. Instead of offing us, why don't you set us up and we'll bring human beings out of the interior for the sugar industry. And this was done. And it became an overnight success. And the prices paid for sugar were so high that popes and kings were caught up in this corruption. It wasn't that people didn't think it was bad. It wasn't that people had never asked themselves these questions. Not at all. This had all been settled in 600 AD. It was that they were rapacious. It was the first time a single race has been singled out for servitude. One thing about Roman slavery, it was marvelously democratic. You know, everybody was potentially could be a slave. People talk about the scourge of cocaine. It's as to nothing what was done to the values of Western Europe in the pursuit of sugar. I mean, nobody is suggesting that we bring back slavery with the Pope's approval in order to produce more blow. But this was an entirely reasonable proposition to these entrepreneurial types in the 16th century. So it's just a little historical aside. I have all this stuff at my fingertips because the book that I'm writing for Bantam is called Plants, Drugs, and History. And I want to show that stemming from this breakdown of the psychedelic relationship, then all the addictions and substance obsessions that come out of that are an effort to get back to this primal equilibrium. Well, now I think I'll just stop there and hope that there are questions out of this, since it's the first thick hit.
Your comment on the snake.
Well, there was a kind of, it passed through my mind to talk about it. If you look at the history of snakes in mythology, they almost always have good information about immortality. Snakes can be relied upon for that. There's a very interesting myth. Some of you have heard me tell it. It's an old Minoan myth from the Cretan civilization that was the last outpost of this partnership thing. Some of you may remember Pasiphae, because she was a really interesting figure in Greek mythology, because she was so fascinated by the sexual energy of bulls that she had Daedalus, the same guy who would later attempt to fly home to the mainland. She had Daedalus construct an artificial cow that she could get inside of, so that she could have sex with these bulls. And, don't ask me what was going on, except that these Cretan women are not to be messed with, obviously. But there's an obscure myth that relates to her son that casts light on the Genesis myth. It's the myth of the story of Glaucus and Polyidus. Glaucus was the son of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae, and when he was a young child, he was playing in the pantry of the palace one day, and he fell into a huge vat of honey. Well, now, you may or may not know that across the Middle East, the dead were buried in these kinds of jars, and sometimes kings were buried in honey. But anyway, Glaucus, this little kid, he fell into this honey pot and drowned, and no one could find him. No one knew where he was. No one thought to look in this particular honey pot in the pantry. And the king and the queen were frantic, and they went to their diviners, and they said, help us find our son. And the diviners said, well, we can't find your son, but we know who can. And the king said, well, so who? He said, it will be the man who can compose the most apt simile regarding a three-colored cow in your herd. Now, what this means is not clear. Obviously, the story may be garbled at this point. But anyway, a man of language was what they were saying, a man who can compose this simile. So then the king called everybody together and asked people to compose a simile on the three-colored cow. And lo and behold, this guy, Polyidus, which means man of many ideas. Polyidus produced a brilliant simile on the three-colored cow. And so the king said, "This is great. You will be the person who can find my son." So Polyidus went into trance and saw young Glaucus pickled in the honey pot in the basement. So he said to the king and queen, "Well, I've located your son. You're not going to like this. He's dead." And they went and they got him, and he was dead. And the king said, "Well, you seem to be the smartest guy around, Polyidus. You found the boy. I want you to bring him back to life." And Polyidus said, "No way, that's not I'm not that kind of a magician." The king waxed wroth, as kings do, and put him imprisoned him with the body, and said, "You're not coming out until my son lives." So Polyidus was completely freaked out by this situation, didn't have a clue on what to do, and was just basically wailing and tearing his hair in this cell, and he noticed a snake come in, a little hole in the wall, and he thought that the snake was going to do something to the corpse of the boy, and that he would get into even worse trouble. So he took a stone and threw it at the snake and killed it. And it was lying there dead on the floor. Then he went back to freaking out about his predicament. And a while passed, and another snake came. And the snake came, and it took one look at the first snake, and before Polyidus could make a move, it backed out and was gone. And some time passed, and the second snake came again. And this time it had some leaves in its mouth. And it went over to the dead snake and did something, and the snake lived. And Polyidus rushed forward and seized a little fragment of the plant and saw what it was, rang his jailers and asked the quantities of this plant to be brought, and with it he revived Glaucus and brought him back to life. And everybody was delighted, and Polyidus thought that now he would be allowed to go back to Syracuse, which was his home. And the king said, "No, you're too valuable a man to me. I can't let you go. I'll only let you go once you teach my son everything you know." So Polyidus, so he did. He settled down and he took on young Glaucus as his student, and he taught him everything he knew. And then, years later, Glaucus is a young man. The king has given Polyidus permission to return to his homeland. They all walk down to the boat together, and at the very last moment, Polyidus says to Glaucus, "Your old teacher has just one request of you." And he says, "What is it?" And he says, "I want you to spit in my mouth." He says, "Okay." So he does. He spits in his mouth. And at that moment, all of the magical teaching and understanding returns to Polyidus, and he walks up the gangplank and sails away. Now, this is an interesting myth for several reasons. Your question about Eden, you see, the snake knew the secret of immortality in both stories. The snake had information about the tree of life, and the snake had information about the plant of immortality. What's interesting also about this story is Glaucus means blue-gray. And blue-gray is the color that psilocybin-containing mushrooms turn when bruised. And preserving mushrooms in honey was a well-known maneuver in those areas. So what this may be is a death and resurrection myth connected with the mushroom as both the thing raised from the dead and the thing then which is somehow caught up with Hirosgamos transformation. So that's the Eden name of the snake. Yeah. That's right. He wrote a book called The Breakdown. It's called The Breakdown of Consciousness in the Bicameral Body. This guy, Julian Jaynes, his idea was, and it's an interesting idea, the whole thing was somewhat frustrating because he wrote a very big book on the role of hallucinations in shaping culture, and aside from one piddling mention of mescaline, you would never know that there are plants which cause hallucination. But Jaynes wanted to say that until very recently, the mental life of human beings was very different than it is for us. He wanted to say that as recently as Homeric time, which is 1000 BC, people didn't have egos. People were sort of robot-like. And then if they got into a very tight spot and were about to be offed or something, a god would speak. It wouldn't appear, but this god would speak and tell them what to do. Say, like, get out of there, do this, do that. And that this psychic function, previously perceived as the voice of God, eventually was integrated into the structure of the psyche and became the ego. Much in the same way that the mitochondria of the cell, of the animal cell, were once free-swimming bacteria, 300, 400 million years ago, and they became embedded and entangled in a larger cellular matrix. So Jaynes is trying to say that this godlike ego became incorporated as an ordinary psychic function. What caused this to happen was traders going from one widely separated human group to another would bring the news that God was not saying the same things in all places. And this started philosophical disputation on its noble road. And then people realized, well, if the gods aren't saying the same things, then it's not really God, and so then what is it? And slowly integrated it. I don't believe his theory. I think it's a good theory for academia. It forces them to look at some of their premises a little more carefully. I don't think it's about opening a channel to the non-dominant sphere of the brain. I think that's a way of it's a metaphor for this boundary dissolution. Maybe if you have an open channel to the non-dominant side of your brain, it's like a psychedelic experience. But I suspect that's too good to be true, and that probably you need the psychedelic experience. But clearly we are cut off from something, either the other half of our brain or the vegetable matrix of life or something like that. We are cut off. I mean, history is a very unbalanced situation. That's why it's temporary, because it's a high state of disequilibrium.
Major impact on what you get.
Well, sugar. I consider sugar definitely a drug, and one of the most heavily addicted drugs on a world scale that there is. There have been numerous episodes over the past few hundred years. I mean, I maintain all culture is styles of relating to chemicals. Alcohol culture, the way in which it imprints early sexual experiences, that sort of thing. When Napoleon invaded Egypt, he took a huge number of scholars with him, and everything from furniture styles to cuisine was imported back into France, and so was hashish. And hashish and laudanum, tincture of opium, had a tremendous influence on the romantic imagination, both its fecundity and its morbidity. I mean, that's typical opium, reverie, all that stuff. So, drugs are like cultural styles or languages. They're invisible to us. Very few people don't have drug dependencies. I mean, most of what life is regulating yourself through the waking part of the day, either making decisions to do or not do certain kinds of things. I mean, isn't that most people's story? I mean, I consider myself a moderate drug user, and I get up in the morning and then the first thing I do is I make tea. And that's a low hit of caffeine. That lasts until about 10:30. Then I get serious and we make a huge pot of coffee. And then that allows me to work until like 2 in the afternoon. Then I have to have another cup of coffee, but with a J in order to be, keep it going. And, then there's sugar regulation on the side of this. And then when you add into it, non-invasive drugs like television. I mean, the average American watches 4.5 hours of TV a day. Imagine if there was a drug that made that kind of claim on people's time. My God, we'd regard Western civilization as going to hell in a handbasket. But, the drugs of the future are likely to be these non-invasive electronic drugs. I just finished writing an article on virtual reality for Magical Blend magazine. Do you all know what virtual reality is? Virtual reality is a technology being very, very rapidly perfected and brought to market, where you put on a silk glove with sensors at every joint, and you put on a hood with television screens very close to your eyes, or fiber optic screens very close to your eyes, and you're in a reality. You're in another world. It's a world that you can touch, you can feel. But it's a different kind of world than this world, because in that world, if you want to go somewhere, if I wanted to see the TV set over there, you point, and it comes to you. You open your hand, it stops moving toward you. Close your hand into a fist, it rotates you 180 degrees in the phase space. It's called virtual reality. Oh, well, Mattel has already begun to market. You've probably seen ads for it and just closed your mind. The glove of power. Have you seen these ads? The glove of power. And that's just a Nintendo system. And what it does is it images the glove on the screen. You put on this glove. There's a glove on the screen. You wiggle your thumb. It wiggles. There's a lever on a machine in the game. You reach out and you pull it, and the lever reacts. And this is with Cradola equipment. I mean, I couldn't believe the primitiveness of this scene. I felt like it was like a science fair project gone apeshit. But what they're talking about, is very fast processing of images at extremely great depth. They're going to do this. The entertainment potential of it is clear. This has to do with some of the scenarios of the future that we'll talk about this afternoon, because virtual reality is very important to creating a sane human future. No, that's something else. That's brain stimulation technology to cause... Yeah, that's a different thing. I will talk about it a little. It's the idea that there are machines that can duplicate drug experiences or create equally interesting neurological experiences. And it's done with goggles, with flashing lights around the perimeter, and then a sound. By varying the frequency and amplitude of the flashing light as it beats against the incoming sound, you can create very interesting neurological states. They're not... Well, they are and they aren't like psychedelics. Nothing is very much like a really breakaway psychedelic experience. But it is interesting that with these machines, so much imagery and so much color can be coaxed out of these setups. Just a few weeks ago, I was at a place in Berlin called Relax Berlin. And it's a place designed for yuppies on their dinner, office breaks, to come and spend 40 minutes under these machines. And so far, I haven't seen any that have really impressed me. They all work much better if you smoke some dope, which probably is going to be the last word on them for a while. The virtual reality is much different. The virtual reality is not a neurological chaos. It's a programmed reality of some sort. I mean, the one I was in was, so banal it brought tears to your eyes, but what it was an office. It was a reception area. A reception area, and then you walk through a door, and then there was a large desk with a telephone on it, and a bookcase with a couple of books in it. But I discovered something immediately. I mean, it was not an intended discovery. I forgot that if you point at something, it moves toward you, or you appear to move away from it. And I would just let my pointing hand drift downward. And when I would do that, I would burst through the ceiling of the office. And then if I didn't change my position, the office and the attached antechamber just were shrinking smaller and smaller in a kind of olive drab space that I was clearly, flying into infinity. And there was nothing else in this reality. Well, so then I did the fist thing. It turned me around 180 degrees, and then I could get back down to the office hanging in this olive drab space. But it's a freaky technology because the human visual apparatus is unbelievably forgiving of error. In fact, the human visual apparatus is set up to suppress error. So even though you have this fairly Mickey Mouse technology, your eye and your brain are just working like dogs to make it all into a real world and to paper over all the weird stuff about it, Well, so if the technology can come closer, the brain is waiting to fill in all the chinks and make it very nice. It's manufactured, it's just very costly. It's at the level now where the only reason you would buy one is if you wanted to experiment with it. You were a company or so filthy rich that it just didn't matter. $50,000. Oh, it's coming down. The way they envision it, you see, what it requires is it requires very large and fast parallel processing computers. It is not something that's going to be standalone in the home. It's going to be sold over cable so that the really powerful computers to do this will be accessed over the phone lines. What the end consumer will have is simply the helmet and the glove, and then they want to do a full body stocking so that your whole body will be in there. And then they have the big research project they're working on now is called RT for 2, Reality for 2. And you can see the implications. If you can get one other person in there with you, you can get everybody. If you can get one, you can have 50,000. Jared Lanier's thoughts on the matter. Yeah. Yes, well, Gibson, who knew nothing about computers, was the first person to come up with this concept. He called it cyberspace. He just thought that very large databases should be configured to be like physical objects so that you know your way around, so that, you jack into cyberspace. This enormous red rectangle, the size of the Empire State Building, that is the Wells Fargo database. Further on down the boulevard, that turquoise trapezoid, that is Defense Department data. And then on the other side of the street and 2 blocks over is the National Medical Index. In other words, he said these databases should be thought of as places, and we'll create a world, a virtual world, where you travel from place to place to get data. You see, the interesting thing, if any of you are familiar with the Macintosh computer interface, what makes it so user-friendly is that it treats everything like ordinary objects, so that as monkeys, we understand perfectly how to do this. I mean, when you're in a program like Full Paint and you want a paintbrush, you must go and get your paintbrush. And when you're done using it, you must put it back in your toolbox. Now, there is no toolbox and there is no paintbrush. They're virtual. But nevertheless, you treat them the same way you treat non-virtual objects, as they're coming to be called.
This kind of equipment should not be in the hands of people.
Well, you know, Tim Leary said years ago, LSD is a substance which can cause psychotic reactions in people who don't take it. And, you know, I've seen a lot of psychosis caused by drugs that people didn't take. I mean, see, it's all, the Western mind is so quirky. I mean, we would accept a machine, I think. The fact that television has gotten as far as it has with as little criticism. But if people were smoking pot 4.5 hours a day, I mean, there'd be a national soul-searching uproar over it. So we just have certain biases and certain canalized ways of thinking that are easier for us to move down. The future isn't very comforting for that kind of know-nothingism, because electronic stimulation is very, very possible. And the difference, you know, computers are becoming more like drugs. Drugs are becoming more like computers. The computers of the future will be taken orally, and the drugs of the future will probably be jacked into. So getting hung up on the language of it, the important issue is the alteration of consciousness. What is it, and what is it good for? What does it say about who we are? What can we do with it? The reason the people who've produced virtual reality, the people who are in charge of trying to think of something neat to do with it, haven't gotten very far. I mean, of course it will make astonishing pornography possible. Of course, cleaning up radioactive waste spills will now be very easy. Fixing space stations, if you happen to have one, will be less of a problem with virtual reality, because you'll go in virtual reality outside, find the box, lift the lid, turn the screw. You'll do it 10 times in virtual reality before you'll actually put on the suit and go out. But what I think virtual reality is good for is showing each other the insides of our minds, that we are going to be able to create art like nothing that has ever been seen before. In fact, one of the mavens of virtual reality, Eric Gullickson, has predicted that most designing in the 21st century will be virtual design. I mean, when you think that, you know, it costs nothing to design a Piranesi cathedral than it does to design a modest A-frame, because the thing is going to be built of light. So everybody can live at Versailles if that level of ostentation is attractive to them. I think that I look forward to this. I want to take the architectural perspectives of Bibiana and walk through those, you know, mile-long colonnade corridors, reflecting pools and all that sort of thing. And then what interests me about virtual reality on every level is, it goes back to the DMT experiences that we talked about earlier this morning, that on DMT, the way in which the entities communicate is with a visible language. a language that's beheld rather than heard is used. Well, this is a higher signal, it's a better signal, less degradation of intentionality, visibly beheld signal. You know, the old rock picture is worth 1,000 words. So I think we could create a new modality of communication in virtual reality, modeled on the psychedelic experience. I mean, what would it be like to slave a voice synthesizer to a virtual reality with software instructions such that, for example, every time I use the connector and a fluorescent turquoise polygon would become suspended in the air. And every time I used a certain verb, a different kind of topological manifold would be plugged in to the connector. In other words, if we changed the stuff of language into virtual tinker toys, then we could use our voice to drive an assembly of visible objects in the virtual reality. You follow what I'm talking about? Good. Well, it's noon, so time for lunch. We'll be back here at 4 to 6. Okay. Well, is there anybody who was left unbalanced by the brutal truncation of this morning's session and needs to ask a question? We can talk a little bit about this morning's session, and then I thought, if he's still game, that Ken, who is a regular attendee at these things, he has a sort of interesting field work story to tell that would be inspiring, and then we could talk about that or other issues, or if it went flat, I would synthetically create a focus. So, okay. Is there anything left over from this morning, or any line of discussion that needs to be pursued on that? I think we took it up to the notion of virtual reality being promising for the production of a kind of higher order logos of communication that would be beheld rather than heard. This is a fave theme of mine because the way I finally interpreted what was happening inside the DMT experience was that these creatures were speaking in this visibly beheld language, and I had never even conceived of such a thing. I mean, I just assumed language is something you hear with your ears, but it turns out, no, that's just one way to do it, and another way is this visual input model. And it seemed to me it's a true form of telepathy. It's not telepathy as we might have anticipated. My notion of telepathy was always, I hear what you think, not I see what you mean, and you see it too. And we contemplated as three-dimensional objects. So virtual reality is interesting for that. See, I think that the engineers and the people who are putting this together don't realize how odd the insides of our minds are. What a revolution it will make if we can show the insides of our minds to each other, and the imagination can leave a trail, as it were, so that imagine each trip of every one of us would be set on a stacker here, and we would just move among the cuts and say, well, here's Ken in the jungle an hour and 20 minutes into his, and here's McKenna 5 years ago on X, Y, and Z, and have these things discussable as objects, as media. Well, this looms, I think, and it will empower the creation of a language and a community of understanding about these things that will be, lighting a wildfire of shamanic awareness. I mean, it's approaching critical mass, the ability to talk about this other reality in 20th century English. It's approaching critical mass and the levels of minimal. Yeah, my idea of the real state of balance that I could achieve, able to perfect what psychedelics promise, is a kind of state of mind where it was perceived as evil, but it was valued. In other words, that you come so into phase with the powers of things that your wishes are the wishes that would be there in your absence almost, so that you are invisibly merged with the flow. And when this happens, and for some reason, this is really an interesting subject, and I confess that my best guesses are not very creative. This thing that everybody talks about, which is when you first start using psychedelics, the deep ones, you set off cascades of synchronistic events. And some of these are what psychologists call delusion of reference, in that every license plate, if you live in California, seems to convey a unique message designed for you. But some of it cannot be so easily dismissed. Some of it actually appears to be disruption of the statistical flow of casuistry in the so-called three-dimensional world. And getting a handle on that, getting does it mean that causality is something embedded in our language, and that when we dissolve the boundaries of language, what we ordinarily think of as the laws of physics, or at least the laws of statistical probability, begin themselves to protect? That actually, I think a lot of people in our Venn of thought elixir the notion that the world is made of language. The question is how to take that idea and ride off on it. If wishes were horses, beggars would ride. Well, if the world is made of language, we should be able to construct stallions of syntax and just ride on down the road. Is this possible? Is it worth entertaining the idea? The forward escape that is going to be necessary to save the planet or even save our own skin is going to be extraordinarily creative. It's not a stopping of anything. It's not a managing of anything, because nothing can be managed. You have just the unleashed rapaciousness of 5 billion intelligent human beings spreading out over the planet. So the breakthrough is going to have to come in a major reconceptualizing of reality. How can it be done? Are we to shrink ourselves down to the size of flies and all live in an ecology on the dark side of the moon? Is that a reasonable alternative? How can we manage the present population back down to a population that could be in balance on the Earth? It will take thousands of years to get us down to the So the breakthrough has to be a kind of deus ex machina, or more a homo ex machina. In other words, the man must create a way out of the impasse. And obviously, the umbilicus of reality is tied somewhere in the cerebral cortex. All put together. And the trick then is to tease out the real operational set up the parameters of apparent existence. And what shamanism is, what the psychedelics are, is simply heaving brickbats into the still consciousness, and then analyzing the late mechanical perturbations that result from this, and trying to create some kind of linguistic transform that allows you to map it back onto something. But someone said, who isn't here, that he completely rejected a notion very dear to my heart, which is that we're living in unique times, that history is a compressive force that is moving toward a conclusion, and that this conclusion is now not that far in the future. And he said he didn't believe this, and that he was a steady stater, and so on. But you see, the presence of ourselves is the indication that an extraordinary event is about to take place on Planet 3. We have emerged out of animal organization over the past 100,000 years. We have emerged out of tribalism in the last 10,000 years. The fact that we are undergoing this informational foment, this self-reflection of the universe and recoding and recasting of it that spins off technologies and languages like the nuclear. This signifies that something unusual is going on in the biosocial dynamics of the planet. It's history. History is some kind of phase transition. It's a highly complex state of disequilibrium where mind is nature undergoes kind of birth out of system through the intermediary of technique. Place in it is what shamanism has always been about. And because it's always had this urgency, because on a planetary scale, across it extrudes biology, holding together of organizations that is coming back. What are we? How can we be? What is the place that we are? Well, you can think about this in an armchair, or you can perturb the people, as it were, with the they centrally address the issue. I compared them to what the telescope was for astronomy in the 16th century, or what the atom smasher and particle accelerator was for the study of the primary structure of matter. I mean, here is a tool that, you get phenomena when you apply this tool to mind. It isn't a stilled surface, or you aren't caught in the insect mechanics of social games, but instead, really begin to penetrate to the more profound levels. Well, Ken, would you like to tell what you've been up to recently, in as much or as little detail as you care to? Ken is a very sharp guy. He's run a Fortune 500 corporation, speaks excellent Spanish, one thing and another, and he's lovable for sure here.
Well, sometimes I think that Terence is a sort of an instigator of dormant curiosities. So he certainly has stirred up my curiosity in the ayahuasca experience. So through, and he asked me to tell you a little bit about what I've just come back from, and through a series of sort of coincidental happenings, a couple of friends and purpose of our going down there was simply to come with direct contact with the ayahuasca experience and the way it's practiced there, and the way it's used, and the purpose for which it's used there. So we had a very surprising and rewarding trip, and we came into contact with the local native Peruvians there in the Amazonian Peru that use this stuff on a regular basis. And I guess I'll just make some descriptions of what happened. But what we found there was simply that these people use this thing on a very regular basis. It is not important their religious way. This is individual practitioners. Their practice and the technique varies a lot between one and the other. Varying beliefs, although generally many Scaros, people live in what you might describe as magical context. They believe very strongly in magic. By that I mean nothing in their system is coincidence or coincidental. Everything has a reason, and usually the reason has to do with at their level is somebody's trying to harm you, or somebody's trying to take power from you, or somebody's envious of you, and this is the reason for some of the diseases. Their other explanations are that you have, for example, been in contact with people that have a negative charge. Then in some way you picked up this negative charge. In some other cases,
death is unbound.
Somebody is distraught for whatever reason, and then even without knowing them, you come across them or you're in contact with them, and you pick up this bad vibe, so to speak.
But the flames will also burn the impenetrable thorns. Farewell it is then. You'll be Elden Lord yet.
So the purpose of the healer, the curandero, is to remove either these bad charges or to remove the deliberate intent that somebody has placed upon you, deliberate intent to harm you, and that's a function of it. Now their system is strongly influenced by all these magical things, and to give you an idea of how surreal the whole thing, I think most of you have, or some of you may have heard about this book written by Bruce Land, Wizard of the Upper Amazon. Well, this was a story about a man that was captured by Indians and lived a lot of his life as a healer of a native tribe, but then he finally went to the healers. Well, there was a Spanish book published about him too. I don't think it was translated into English, but it was interesting because, for example, some of the chapters there in the book describing this fellow, and his native name was Eno Moxo. Eno Moxo was his Spanish name in Manuel Cordova. But for example, some of the chapters indicate this is for you how the belief in magic permeates the whole environment. For example, some of the chapters are titled "Where We Shall See That Masks Are Always Below the Face." And another chapter is how certain healers create persons. And another chapter is Master Eno Moxo. This guy disappears blowing smoke. So it's a very poetic thing. These things are very magical, and they have not sort of left that magical level yet. So with that context, what happens is they have these sessions and they gather together maybe anywhere from 6 to 10 people in any one session. The sessions take usually place at night, after nightfall. They have a very strict belief in diet, where diet consists of different periods of abstinence from a number of things. Depending on what your purpose is and what you are intending to do, it may be 7 days of diet, it may be 15 days of diet, it may be 30 days of diet. In diet, you have to abstain from things like salt, sweet, any pork or lard or anything close to pork or lard. No heavy, greasy things of any kind. And also no sex. No sex is very important. And in their view, that doesn't mean you have to be celibate. It means that if you are intending to take ayahuasca or for a certain specific purpose, you should be celibate for a day or so many days as the master prescribes. And the reason in their view is that if you have any sex, this is nothing wrong, it just simply takes away your energy. And in the explanations that we were given there, the plants will not talk to you if you violate the diet. So the sessions happen after night. They recommend that you do not eat anything. They recommend that you adhere to certain diets. And you take this potion, which is a relatively small amount. The brew is a boiled down mixture of several components, and one of the aspects of it is that it is not particularly palatable. It is not nauseating, but it is not something too palatable. And when it goes down, you feel a certain reaction to it, some nausea. It varies between different people. In some cases, people throw up at some point during the session. They just vomit it out. In their view, this is normal, to be expected, natural. Many of them consider the vomiting as positive in the sense that they look upon it as a purge. It says that if you vomit during the session, A, it doesn't detract from your experience, and B, it means that you have been purified, that you're getting rid of some of the poisons, toxins, bad things that you have in your body. So in their view, the vomiting isn't negative. Everybody does not absolutely vomit. I mean, it happens occasionally here and there, depending with experience. And these sessions last anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. So if you begin at 7 o'clock or something, the thing is usually over by 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. And the purpose of the session is there are several purposes. They do it, A, of course, to heal. And healing means, in their view, a very specific thing, at least the people who were in contact with. They say that the divine, that the brew itself, empowers you and gives you the vision. Specifically, it gives the healer the vision as to what is wrong with a person, if it's a case of disease. But curiously enough, that the actual healing is not done by the vine. They firmly believe that the healing is done by the chanting. And this gets a little complex. The healer, during the course of the session, pronounces or sings these, what they call icaros. And the icaro is a chant. It's not a song. It's like a song. The chants are only occasionally have a word of Spanish here and there. Most of it is either in Quechua, the local Indian language, or often they are nonsense syllables, like dee-dee-dee or na-na-na or something like that. But they go in a musical, up and down. Now, in their view, the plants, each individual plant, and of course, zillions of plants, they all have different uses, and they all know the uses of the different plants. So it's just like a open pharmacopoeia. They're all over the place as to what to do. But then they believe that the healer, under the influence of the ayahuasca, contacts either the ayahuasca plant or any other plant that he wishes. Converses with that plant, brings out what they call the mother of the plant, which is another way of saying the spirit of the plant or the genius of the plant. And that spirit of the plant will teach the healer how to sing that particular song of that particular plant, and what that song will heal, and what that plant, if given as a leaf or a tea or another combination, will cure. So the healer's function then is to take the ayahuasca along with the patient. They will both take it. The healer's function then uses the ayahuasca to acquire power and to see. And then, once identified what the problem is, selects the icaro, the song, to sing to do the healing. And the icaros, as you sit there, and of course you're under the influence of the ayahuasca, the icaros under the high become very powerful, and they're almost like a hypnotic thing that they, in their opinion and in my experience, increases the effect of the drug. So it potentizes the effect of the drug.
And did you find that these icaros are actually, you see them, because they drive the fabric of the hallucination?
Yes.
And they talk about it this way. They call it painting. To chant is painting.
That's right. You see them.
Yes, you see.
You're hearing, and in fact you're seeing them, and in fact you're touching them, as you know.
And they have an emotional texture as well as a chroma. I mean, it's hard to explain. It's very rich.
I'd like to just read you in that regard one of the other titles of the chapters that I was referring to a minute ago, and then God says, Inomoxo says that words are born, they grow, and they reproduce themselves, but not in Spanish. You have to do them in Quechua, all right? This is the reason for the Icaros. So as you go into the session, there are different phases, I guess, which are quite different from, they vary from person to person, I presume, but you go through what I would describe as a sort of a discomfort area, or a phase in which you sort of don't feel too good, and you feel a little nauseous and so forth. You progress on to a second phase, and of course I'm generalizing, and this would vary according to people, but you progress on to what you might call the terror phase. And at that point, the horror, the terror, all right? And that, I think, has to do with fear of the loss of ego. You lose control. So you realize you're on a roller coaster that is totally out of your control or power to do anything bad. Of course, that instills trepidation. Then you move on to a third phase, which I guess would be the circus. And in the circus, you generally see incredible gardens, colors, entities, variations in architectural detail. I mean, it's incredible, and you sit there in dazed wonder looking at this beauty, and you wonder how the work can be so beautiful. And then you finally go into a sort of a contemplative phase, which is probably the longest in duration, in which you have gone through all of these other trepidations, and then go into this phase in which you contemplate. You see yourself clearly enough. You see other people around you in the session, and quite often you see them under a different guise than they normally would be, and that was a common experience for me anyway. And by that I mean, for example, you would have somebody sitting next to you, and during this contemplative phase, you would open your eyes and see somebody with human legs, but the body of a bird. Or you would see somebody else, which I'm describing actual visions that I had, seated down there as a monk with a shaved head. And of course, he's not a monk, and he's not dressed as a monk, and he doesn't have a shaved head, but that's what you're seeing. And this is not a daydream. Well, when you ask them about it, and you ask the healer, they explain that what you're seeing really are, it's like a super developed intuition. We all have intuitions. Right? We all have intuitions about people we meet, and we feel, well, I don't like that person, or this person looks angry, or whatever. Well, this is sort of like that intuition elevated to a super sensitivity, in which you're not sort of intuiting it, you're actually seeing a manifestation. So if you're seeing somebody as a monk with a shaved head, you're looking at an aspect of that person's personality. These can be quite revealing and quite surprising. You often see people as animals. That's another situation. Well, the other thing that they use during the sessions is the healer that is in charge is sort of like a presiding person. He controls the session. He can control the session in many ways, and some of the things that they use are camphor water. They put some camphor in water, and of course the camphor only partially dissolves on the water, but it gives it a sort of a camphor smell. They also use sort of like an old cologne that's been running around Latin America for a long time, called agua de Florida. Florida water. And it's
Did you drink it?
Well, actually, I didn't drink it, but many of them put a little bit in the brew.
Oh,
And the purpose of that is to disguise some of the unpleasant smell. Now, agua de Florida is just, in effect, a cheap cologne. It's like a cologne with some, cloves and some spices. It's not unpleasant. But anyway, they use that, and they believe that as a powerful cleanser. And the other thing they use is fresh tobacco. It's not the tobacco that we know here from cigarettes and pipes. This is just the raw leaf, cured a little bit, chopped up, and it's a very clean smell. I don't smoke, and I don't particularly like smoking, but to me this is a very powerful, and they believe it's a very powerful curing agent. In fact, one of the better ones in their opinion. So they use the tobacco smoke. Not at all. No, it's a very clean, very pure smell. So in these sessions, the healer would, pass the brew around. Some healers have, since this is really not only, pure jungle, they've been citified to some degree. Some of them have a strong Christian influence. So some of them recite prayers, invoke the Virgin, certain saints. Many of them don't. And many of them are really not into the Christian part at all. Many of them they're simply, they don't talk about prayers, they just sing the songs. After they distribute the brew, they blow the tobacco smoke. They believe that blowing the tobacco potentiates the brew. After, no, that's right, they blow.
Does it get you high differently?
Yes. No, it's just plain tobacco. It's not a weed or anything. It's just tobacco, so it doesn't get you high. It's just the smell and the smoke. But they see it as a purifying, as a cleanser, as an empowering agent. So in the session, you sit in a circle. The healer would distribute the potions to everybody after blowing the tobacco smoke on it, and then nothing much happens for about 45 minutes or somewhere around there. And then these 4 or 5 phases that I described before begin to take effect. And during that time, the healer goes around, often individual person after individual person, and he blows smoke on your head, on your back, on your front. He puts some of the agua de Florida or the camphor water or both in his mouth and sort of blows some of that down your back. Tell you that it's a very powerful experience. When you're under the influence of these things, you begin to see the healer not as he is in person, but you begin to see the healer as something quite different. You may see him as an animal, you may see him as a bear, you may see him as something. So this is coming, different things at different times. It's shifting, yeah. And then he would come around to you, and the purpose of the smoke and the agua is to increase to send you higher. There's a different style. Blowing the smoke or something like this comes out of shaman candidated. I can give you an idea of how powerful it can be, especially if you are already You're sitting there, that just...
Or perhaps a giant mantis suck on your anterior.
All of the above.
All of the above, right? Yeah, I know.
He moves around and repeats that with everybody. In some cases, you have a problem, and you tell him ahead of time. He will call you in front of him, sit in front of him, and he will chant directly carols to you, quoting the problem that you have. He will spend 10 minutes with you alone. Well, I did it myself because I didn't feel anything physically wrong. But many people go to these sessions not only for a physical or emotional problem, they go to complete themselves, to learn more, contact another reality. So it is not necessarily a disease-oriented thing, right? Yes, we were describing this morning. All of the entities, this incredible, undescribable reality. That to some degree, and I think that that's different for each person. Expand on that. For example, you ask a question. One for example, I asked a specific question, and then I had all of these long arms coming out after these sheets of paper. And of course, I was trying to read some of the touched and heard.
Was there any?
No, this was.
And the entities, were they steady in image, or were they transforming in geometry? What was their character?
Well, I would describe them as very active, moving around all over the place. They're absolutely clear. I mean, it's no blurred. You're not seeing blurred there. I think one way of describing them is the influence, the chemical influence of the vine is so strong that you almost feel as if this is some magnet in front of you that is drawing you into because, and by that I mean, it's a very strong effect on your body. As you do more of these things, I found that if you were to surrender to this magnet, you would lose most of the experience because most of the interesting things were going around in the periphery. So I felt that the best way to handle it, and I think this you learn after a little bit, is to, be drawn by the magnet, but pay attention to all of the things that are going around. And what's going around is such a variety of things that you have to be alert to catch them,
Did you ever totally surrender to the magnet?
I think if you do, you probably miss part of the experience because it's so powerful that it's... No.
Did you speak to anyone who did?
Yes, well, in the first experiences, the initial ones, because what happens is it's like, you get flown away so far that you just sort of almost unconscious and you're not aware, and then you miss, and then you remember.
And it becomes almost like anesthesia.
So you're kind of...
And in fact, if the dose is really intense, your lips will tingle as a symptom of the onset of anesthesia. Did you notice that?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
well, if you take tingling lip ayahuasca, then one macho hombre.
Some people take more than once. I did not, and I didn't find it necessary. One dose was more than enough.
What is a dose? Is it a jiggerful, a cupful?
Well, that varies too a little bit because, of course, this is a individually boiled and concentrated thing. But usually, some of the sessions we were taking 1/3 of a cup. All right. After you take it for a while, they believe, and I think that is correct, that you need less in amount to get the same effects. So it's instead of your body getting immune to it, it works the other way around. You need less to get to the same place.
See, it's running on DMT and beta-carbolines like harmine, and these things all occur endogenously in the human brain. So it's not, it's the closest thing to a cocktail of neurotransmitters that you could get to. None of these compounds are invasive at all. They're all part of normal metabolism. It's just that the ratios are now going to be shifted radically by the fact that you're doing so much of it.
What's your group
Well, there wasn't any group. We just had the good luck of coming across an active Peruvian shaman who invited us to go down there. And then he introduced us to different masters and teachers that he had had. So that was really as simple as that.
Do they want something? Oh.
Did your experience change on repetitive exposures? Were you able to control the situation more on a second or a third or exposure than you were on the first?
Yeah, two things. They individually prepare the brew in different ways. Some may add some more mixtures, they may add other plants, some may not. So the brew from master to master changes. So your experience also changes. In some cases, you don't have too many visions. In some cases, you feel in an altered state, but in a lesser degree. In some cases, you have a very powerful experience, depending on who prepared it. What I... Oh, yeah.
You really get taken to the cleaners if you don't speak Spanish and you don't know what you're doing. There's a lot of skill before you get to anything done.
Right. The other thing that I found too was, in answer to your question, was that the more you take it, the more you relate to it, and the more productive the experience is, and the more you learn from it. In the first experiences, you're almost overwhelmed by the thing. I mean, it's just your mind is blown out of the bathtub. And as you take it more, then you begin to deal with it more, get more out of it, learn more from it, and it becomes much more productive.
Did you feel a little frightening, like after your first time, do it the second time, or was the overall feeling where you'd like to do it again, even though it was
Well, I like to do it again, but I'll tell you, every time I took it, I was terrified. There's no question about it, and you feel as if you're just absolutely going to work. You know, now this is a subjective experience because, in fact, nobody goes berserk from it, and there's no, to my knowledge, there's really no danger in the sense of as long as you do it within a prescription, but it inspires terror every time you go into it. Yes. 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 Yes, you do. And also, in most of our experiences, the next day, you know, contrary to some other stuff you take, you do not generally feel hungover or drawn out or depressed or weak. In fact, you feel energized. And in addition to that, let me tell you that they see it, in their view, it is, as I told you, it's like a purge. It's like an energizer. It's like, it's not only, they don't see it as a visionary drug, they see it also as a physical purge to help your body. It's like an energizer, like a tonic. And some of these fellows have 3 sessions a week, and they've been doing this for 20 years. So you can see that.
And how do they look?
Good, well.
And do they want something from you for this service of being your guide and your kind of your healer? Do they?
Well, many of these fellows, these fellows that live as a healer, of course, they generally do nothing else. That's their function. It's like being a doctor. Now, there are good ones and there are bad ones, like anywhere else. I think we were lucky in that the ones that we came across with, they were really number one people. And they had the feeling that, you know, they were doing this because they wanted to help, that they wanted to, that was their function. It's like a doctor not interested in money. Now,
They don't have a set theory.
no, they,
You give them.
yes. They live by it, and they have these patients that come to them. So now you realize that this is a low-income society. So, I mean, this is not a lot of money from anywhere, but yes, they do pay, and sometimes in money.
Don't pass a basket or
No,
anything.
no.
Just find a way to give them
Right.
something that
Right. There is no fee, incident. They have no fee.
Did you have prior experience with psychedelics? And if so, is there any contrast compare to other experiences that you had that you got clearly?
Well, I think the closest one that I could describe would be DMT. Yeah.
You had done DMT prior to that.
Yeah.
That was the only one you had done?
No, but this would be the closest, I think.
Something like surrendering to the madness.
Well, the physical effect that you feel from the brew is very powerful, and I mean physically. I mean, you feel the thing in your stomach, and you feel a little bit of nausea, and your body feels,
Every time it rounds a bend in your intestines, it's a metaphysical revelation. And there are many bends in your intestines.
You get diarrhea. You get diarrhea.
Some people do, I did not. But I'm sorry, to get back.
Is that like just being accepting and just going with it?
Well, what happens is the physical effect is very strong, and then the onset of the effect on the brain is quite strong. So you feel like something foreign is taking you over. That's why I mean by the magnet. All right. Like in all of these things, I think you have some degree of control. Now, if you get absorbed or you get focused in what's happening to you physically or emotionally, in the sense of this effect physically on the gut, or this control that takes you over, this power that takes you over, then you sort of lose the experience, because this is what I mean. You get drawn into that magnet, and then you worry about it, and you get nothing else. Meanwhile, the visions are happening, and in the periphery of that magnet or that physical and emotional thing that's going on, you're beginning to see visions, and these things are revealing, and they're telling you things, so you have to deal with the physical part and at the same time not be absorbed by it. And
the psychology is like a roller coaster. If you're going to ride a roller coaster, it does you no good whatsoever to clench your body. It's beyond that. You might as well just open yourself up, because it's bigger than you are, and resistance is just resistance. Well, you try to cling to that, and I don't like the drugs that absolutely destroy the witness. I think the witness is important. Certain drugs so totally take the world away that it's a breakthrough to be able to figure out that you're on a drug. You know that place? It happens on ketamine, where you go through all the emotions. Now I remember, I'm a person on ketamine. That's what this is. Now and what this means is that you're coming down. But these tryptamine, psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, though they distort and carry you into this alien world, the observing self doesn't let it go. Not a glimpse. You're all there, observing all your fears, all your hang-ups, all your
absolutely.
You're there. It's been sick. It's like trying to make sense of the gone mad. I mean, the ayahuasca is strong the way I experience it. It's like a moving wall of sort of angry, crisscrossing, chattering, mechanical stuff, which just backs up, and then it just breaks loose like a fork, and I'm swept away. The early things are described. There is this phase where the boundaries dissolve, everything comes to pieces, and you literally shift your reality to pieces. Space there. And then the impression I had was terrified by the weather, and then just finally that on a beach somewhere, my face buried in the sand, just, washed up. And then I sat up, joined, and visions stabilized deep, this DMT long and long.
daunting. I made a little list that may be interesting for you. I asked them, what do you take ayahuasca? And these are the things that they mention. They say to preserve health, to manipulate the supernatural, to travel up here, to predict the future, to discover peace and to discover infidelity. A lot of people come to them and they say, my wife or my husband, can you tell me if that's true? To ask for wisdom, to heal disease, to discover to reach the essence of things. And then finally, as a courage, as a tonic. And the last, the other thing I wanted to tell you is that they have, this strong belief in evil and good, of course, and a lot of the things that happen to you is because somebody's. And then if you talk to some of the more enlightened of them and that are a little more psychologically aware, you realize that this thing is, you can't discount it as being a very primitive or, very stupid, uncivilized thing. Not at all. It's a very sophisticated system. And what they say is, that there are good and bad people like everywhere else. That many of the people that get into the power that ayahuasca gives them, we all have good and bad things inside of us. That people that are not aware of this thing, they have some of the bad things inside them come out. And they don't want to admit that it's part of their dark side, part of their negative side. So when you can't admit that that is part of you, then of course the only other explanation is it was put there by somebody else. And that somebody else must be something evil that is trying to harm me. And that in a primitive, original environment with this, when this was, in the jungle and the Indians were not yet cityfied, that it was all good because the healer either healed diseases or cured troubles and so forth, or in case that he was trying to defend himself from the other tribe, he was also good because he was defending his own people against the other enemy, the other tribe. But that now in a cityfied environment, of course, where it's partially civilized, and there is no other tribe, so the other tribe is somebody evil. It's, so you can't really, the thing works a little bit less well, but that's their sort of viewpoint, you have to deal. And then if you're dealing with the good people, the good, centered shamans, they say that you have to learn all of these powers, but that you use them only to protect yourself, that you don't use them to harm anybody else, that the function, you have to learn all of the power, and then you use the power only to benefit people, but not to, or to protect yourself, but not to harm somebody else.
When this was first discovered in the 1910 to 20 period, they called the alkaloid in Banisteriopsis caapi telepathy, because they actually believed that these people were experiencing some kind of group state of mind induced by this stuff. Then later it was discovered that it was conspecific to harmine, which had been isolated earlier from Pergamon Harmala. The law of nomenclature dictates you take the earlier name. But Ken's list is interesting. Things like observing the future, finding lost objects, determining infidelities. What all this means in mathematical terms is a higher dimensional perspective, a perspective from which the closed doors of this world are open doors. And Ralph Abraham, who some of you may know, has suggested that one way to model the psychedelic experience is to take seriously the possibility that because we live in a three-dimensional matrix, the incoming data about the world is neurologically processed into a usable three-dimensional map.
but under the influence of psychedelics, higher dimensional mappings of the same data are provided, and this would entail the possibility of not predicting the future, at least finding lost objects and seeing behind closed doors and knowing the hidden motives of people's actions, which would be a very powerful thing in the hands of someone who understood magical psychology.
I wonder to what extent there's communication or exchange among the Indian groups with what you described. I went on a trip about 10 years ago to Ecuador. We had sort of the same kind of mechanics, and they also spoke Quechua, how we pronounce that. And I just wondered how far this tradition extends as the Indian tribes communicate with each other about these techniques.
I'm not sure. I can't answer that myself. I'm not there long enough.
I think it's huge that probably this ayahuasca curing religion is probably the world's largest psychedelic religion. I mean, we've talked to people about it, trying to estimate the numbers of people involved in this, and it's, in the several million anyway. I mean, every village in Peru, every river town has at least one practicing ayahuasca, even if people deny it to you. I mean, it is happening all around you. And now it's spreading down into Brazil. These groups like União Vegetal and Santo Daime are revitalization movements in the context of the Brazilian social situation that are using ayahuasca to create a new syncretic religious form there. Yeah.
Does ayahuasca have a meaning?
It means vine of the dead. And the scientific name for the plant is Banisteriopsis capi. Banisteria refers to the pattern of growth of the vine, that the leaves are always directly opposed to each other, like a ladder. So if we were to translate its name into English, we would say it's ladder vine, ayahuasca, Banisteriopsis capi, and capi, the generic, the species name, is the word for it in a native language. It's called capi. It's also called yahe in Colombia. But Ken made a good point that it's made by somebody. See, this isn't like peyote or mushroom or something where it's in its natural state a consumable drug. This has to be made by somebody, and they can make it well or badly. And so it's much more open to manipulation and the influence of the human factor. Yeah.
Well, the image you describe of the opposing leaves and so forth, and the vine of the dead, did you find that reminiscent of the DNA? Does that reflect?
Oh yeah, all of these things. We had many fantasies about ayahuasca being down there, and we saw some of the information that the plants were telling us was so incredible that I don't advance the fact. But the drift of the fantasy when you're in the jungle is you begin to see it as, under the influence of psychedelics, you begin to see it as some kind of very highly integrated data transfer. It's like a coral reef. And certain organisms are playing major roles in moving this stuff around. So that the Banisteriopsis liana that grows up to 300 meters long through the jungle and has its tissue laden with these highly bioreactive beta-carbolines is like an antenna. It's a molecular antenna picking up and broadcasting.
I'm right here. Your thing let me dot past it. Where did you go?
Perturbations in the bottom. This is not just tripping to understand. What appears to be going on when you stand there stoned on 5 grams and ask yourself what's going on. Did you get enough into the jungle, Ken, to hear these waves of insect sound that move across the...
Yes.
Well, these things are intense. I mean, it goes from, relative silence to many decibels of sound in a moving wave, and it's shrill sound. It's the kind of sound a square wave generator puts out when you're trying to pump a chemical solution to a higher state of reactivity. And here are these insects sweeping the jungle with these screeching waves of synergistic sound. That's never been studied. The level of pheromonal regulation, the fact that everything is shedding odor molecules into the air, and everything is integrating and communicating, and it's quite intense. It's like a brain. It's like a mind. It's like a super organized individual, and there you are creeping around inside of it.
I have a couple of questions. How long did you usually fast for before taking ayahuasca?
In a regular session, I found, at least in my case, that if I ate anything after breakfast, I would have trouble keeping it down. So you really have to do it, at least for me, that day. Now, if they talk about if you really want to get into some of the higher levels, higher level means bringing forth the spirit of the plant and getting deeper into the thing, then you have to fast for longer times than just one day. But one day fast, at least for me, was enough to be able to take the brew without throwing up. If I ate anything during the day, I just couldn't keep it down.
And did you guys observe different healers preparing? The proportions that they were using?
No, we prepared one batch ourselves with one healer, so I know how he did it. We asked the other ones. We did not see any other ones. But there are some variations in the additional plants that they put on or not, in the time of boiling, what proportions they put on. Yes, there are variations. There seems to be two schools of thought. One of them is that you just put the ayahuasca vine itself and the Psychotria, which is the DMT containing plant, and the other school seems to be that you use those and also a species of Datura type, and so there are two ways of doing it. Now, also, most of them add, and again, this varies because it's a very individual thing, but some of them tell you that they put a little sugar to modify the bitterness as it goes, when you take it. Some of them put a little of the agua florida to modify the smell, and it's not enough. I mean, agua florida is mostly alcohol, but it's not enough to really affect, give you an alcohol high. It's a few drops only. Some of them put a odor control too, and they tell you that they put rue, like the rue, the herb, to control the aroma, which is a little unpleasant. But these are minor additives, so there are all kinds of variations within that.
So when you would go around to the places, did you actually keep track of, to correlate the experience that you had with the basically different recipes?
Yeah, we found, at least I found that the ones prepared with the Datura added, the Brugmansia added, tended to be more visionary and more powerful than the ones prepared without. Now, the other ingredients, you really don't know how much agua de florida they put in, or how much rue, or how much sugar. That's really minor stuff. Well, they usually, what we saw prepared there was a final amount of 1 liter. And for that, they used 15 leaves, relatively large-sized leaves of the Datura. Well, 1 liter would probably give you enough for 10 to 15 people.
So basically 1 leaf per kid.
Mm.
But it's not Datura, it's a Brugmansia that they call Toad. But it's very strongly solanaceous. When you roll a leaf in your hand, it smells just like Datura.
It's a bush. It's a tree Datura. It's not a creeper. Well, while we were down there, it must
I
have been at
see.
least 8 times.
You're here for some spirit tuning.
Are these compounds and plants all Schedule 1?
Interestingly, beta-carbolines have never been scheduled.
Oh,
But DMT is, of course, scheduled.
Yes.
No, the harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, and 6-methoxyharmalan are all psychedelic, and none have been scheduled.
What is scheduled now?
Scheduled means put on the DEA's list of very bad drugs. If something is Schedule 1, it's treated like cocaine, heroin, LSD, psilocybin, DMT. These are the Schedule 1 drugs. Then there's a Schedule 2 and a Schedule 3.
I see.
So
You're
forth.
here.
But beta-carbolines have not been
This
scheduled.
happened to.
Another interesting thing about ayahuasca that makes it very powerful in the environment where it's operating is it kills intestinal parasites very effectively, worms especially. This is a major problem in the tropical third world. We even brought some back, and at UC Med Center they used it to kill the trypanosomal phase of the malarial organism. Well, if it's even slightly retardant of malaria, and it has a proven ability to retard intestinal parasites, it's definitely, for that alone, it's probably extending the lifetime of its users by a significant percentage.
I have another question about preparation. The ayahuasca, do they use the dry form or do they use the fresh?
No, what we saw there was used fresh, and they simply cut foot-long pieces of maybe anything up to an inch in diameter.
I'll remain with
And
you.
then they mash it
He
and
made me
boil it
who I
down
am
in water
today.
with the
I'd like
cicotrium.
to return the kindness.
Well, it's
in whatever
probably a
small
4 to
way I
1
can.
for ayahuasca
Please, Hugh was always
1 of the
saying that
cicotrium,
you
and then
were
they
a
do not
lord
add the
to him.
romancia till
So
the very end.
slay her with the weapons he smithed. Slay the god
Right.
Maliketh,
At least
who
in the
cursed
tribal
us all.
situation, it seems that ayahuasca is a substance that's used for men. You know, that the men come together and they use that in their visions. And later when he goes back, you know, into his hometown, and as a healer, there are definitely women who, you know, who take to be healed. But I never got the sense that there are actually women healers who used. And I was curious if you ran across those people.
No, the people we met there were generally, I mean, it was not in a strictly jungle environment. This is really in cityfied, and they're usually not pure Indians. They're sort of mestizos, Indian white mixtures. We did not see a woman healer. We did hear that there were women healers. What we did see that the patients that were coming to the healers that we were with, many of them were women, you know, participants.
But when you heard of the women healers, was ayahuasca their drug of choice?
Yes. Yeah. We did not see any.
You know, in some cultures there's a
Yeah.
split.
There's a famous woman healer in southern Peru called Maria Juana Gonzalez Obi. And as a girl of 18, she had lost her toes and fingers to leprosy when she finally found, I think, Manuel Cordova Rios. And he cured her with ayahuasca. Hey! This is possible, who knows? But apparently he did this. And she went on to be a renowned ayahuasquera in the Tingo Maria area.
Did you see the people that came to be healed? Were they healed of whatever they went there for? Did they get what they went for?
I don't know, because of course these are total strangers, and the sessions we were there, some were, and then some were not at the next one and so forth. But